All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the discussion on exploring India's futuristic narratives. I have been super excited for this webinar to happen, and I'm sure you are as well. We have a very interesting panel and a very interesting topic lined up for you. Oops, looks like the slides are not moving. And now they're moving all together. Just wanted to let you know that the India Science Festival is hosting the Spin Your Science Fiction Writing Competition. And this particular webinar is an extension of this competition. This competition is live right now and is inviting entries from across the world, especially in India. The deadline for the submission for this competition is 13th October 2023. This competition is held as part of India Science Festival, and India Science Festival is a celebration of science and technology, which is hosted and organized by FAST India. Just general brief about what FAST India is trying to do. We're working on 4 key verticals and trying to improve the science and technology ecosystem in India. The 4 key verticals here being working with government institutions, different industries and science communication organizations across the country. The science communication vertical focuses on one of the outreach events, that is the India Science Festival, and it is conducted to inspire, nurture, and appreciate science in the country and allow for international and national collaborations across subjects and disciplines. ISF has a goal to make science accessible, and as a result, obviously, it is free and open to all to attend. This year we are hosting ISF in Pune, and it would be amazing if a lot of you attendees who are joining us would also be present there. ISF has been successful throughout the years due to your amazing engagement and interest in something like this. We started off in 2020, and we are going to have our 5th event in Pune in 2024 January. And it would be amazing to have all of you members participate at the festival in Pune. With that, I would like to now just kind of quickly go through our panel members that we have with us here today. We have Sami Ahmed Khan, who is a writer, academic, and documentary producer who engages in Indian science fiction. He is the recipient of multiple grants and fellowships, including the Marie Curie Fellowship. Dr. Khan holds a PhD in science fiction from JNU and has taught at multiple Indian institutions. His creative and critical writings have appeared in leading academic journals, university presses such as MIT Press and Trade Prints. His fiction has been subject of formal academic research and a part of university syllabi in India and in the US. His future war thriller, Red Jihad, has won 2 awards. His second novel, Aliens in Delhi, garnered brilliant reviews and was shortlisted for the Satya Akademi Yuva Puraskar. His latest book, Star Warriors on the Modern Raj, Materiality, Mythology, and Technology of Indian Science Fiction, was longlisted for the BSFA Award in non-fiction category. Welcome, sir. It's nice to have you here. We also have with us Shweta Khilnani. Dr. Shweta Khilnani is an assistant professor at the Department of English, Sri Guru Tej Bahadur Khalsa College, University of Delhi, and the author of Science Fiction in India, Parallel Worlds and Postcolonial Paradigms. Her PhD dissertation topic explored the nexus between the literary, the affective, and the political with respect to digital narratives. Her interests lie in the study of popular cultures and theories of contemporary literature. She is the co-editor of the book Imagining Worlds, Mapping Possibilities, Select Science Fiction Stories. Thank you so much for joining here today, Dr. Khilnani. And finally, we also have with us Supriyo Das. He is an information technology consultant by profession and a co-founder and editor of Kalpabiswa by passion. Kalpabiswa is the only web magazine in Bengali language dedicated to speculative fiction genre. Mr. Das has also edited a number of Bengali science fiction anthologies under the banner of Kalpabiswa Publications and has contributed to the genre as a translator of a number of science fiction stories, which have been published in various science fiction anthologies in Bengali. We welcome all of you here. Apologies for the way the screen is showing. I will just quickly go in with a little bit of the housekeeping rules. I request all of you to keep yourself on mute throughout the duration of the session. And if you have any questions, please feel free to write it in the chat box. If there's any technical issues, please do join the Zoom meeting again, and the attendees can drop in their questions. Any inappropriate questions will not be answered. To open the chat box, click on the 3 dots in the Zoom window taskbar and click the option that means chat, that option that mentions chat, and the session will be recorded. The recording will be shared with all the attendees. With that, I will start shooting questions to our panelists over here. And my first question would be to Dr. Khan. Can you tell us a little bit about what science fiction as a genre is like? And could you also, on a lighter note, share your favorite science fiction stories? This question is also open to other panel members in case you want to come in.
Okay, well, thank you, Shreya. It's a pleasure being at ISF and, just talking with all of you here. It's lovely to meet like-minded people who work on science fiction. It's always a pleasure. So you talked about science fiction as a genre. Now, volumes and volumes have been written just to explicate this question that you asked me. Like books and books and books, and libraries are full of such volumes and tomes and anthologies and God knows what else, but nobody knows the answer. So what we can do is we can maybe try to find something that works as of now for me, and then perhaps after that you can just think about what works for you, because different things works for so different things work for different people. And you're also talking about writing science fiction, and I guess that this panel is structured because it is both about writing science fiction and writing on science fiction, and that's a really big difference. And it's fun to actually just fuse these two paradigms. So I'm going to begin with a very basic thought experiment, which I often do. So just imagine that this is a pen right here, right? Can you guys see this pen? This pen right here? You can see this, right?
Yeah.
If I were to request you to close your eyes for like just 1 second, starting now, and then you open it, and then now you can open your eyes. What do you think has happened? What do you think has happened? Well, exactly. I mean, this is something as simple as instantaneous matter displacement from point A in space-time to point B in space-time, right? Now, how do you approach this? Some of you might say, you know what? This is magic. This is happening because of magic. And you might say this is, well, see Harry Potter, see the entire, phenomena of, apparating from point A to point B. So this is magic, and you're going to use a particular kind of vocabulary, a particular kind of terminology. You're going to create your characters in a particular way. And you would say, okay, well, this is magic. But somebody else might say, you know what, this is not really magic. This is the result of the will of a divine being. This is the Bifrost Bridge. This is Thor doing it. So you can move from point A to point B. And then the vocabulary, the terminology, the characterization you're going to use is going to be very different, right? Or you can be someone like me. And you can say, well, you disassemble the molecules of that particular object at a particular point in space-time and transfer it, quantum entanglement, God knows what else, something like Star Trek transporters, right? And again, you're going to create a different kind of story. So essentially the phenomena that we witness, all of us, is the same, but the way we respond to this phenomena is different. And the way we respond to this phenomena depends on the whys of it. It depends on the context of it. It depends on what you're trying to say, why you're trying to say, what basically speaks to you as a person. It may be, okay, this is very confusing. Okay, I'll explain it again, right? But well, to put it simply, what makes you think that this phenomena is happening? So in the first case, you will say this is magic. If you do that, you are writing fantasy. In the second case, it's the will of a divine being. You are writing mythology or reading mythology, right? In the third case, when you actually use science to explain this phenomena, you're writing science fiction. That is what I was getting at. I hope this is slightly more clearer now. But I can, tell it, talk about it again later. So don't worry about it. So now you have to choose what kind of perspective on the world, on external reality that you would like to adopt. There's no one particular framework that works for everyone. It's entirely up to you. But since we are talking about science fiction, I will talk about science fiction. And then if you are writing science fiction and you use a particular kind of vocabulary to describe a phenomena that is happening, and you write about it, or you write it, either way, you have to ask yourselves why you're doing it, what kind of science are you talking about, because then it seems pretty straightforward. But then the moment you realize that, okay, this is science fiction, but then that is where problem actually begins. Because what kind of science are you talking about? Whose science? Is it alternate science? Is it quasi science? Is it pseudoscience? Is it futuristic science? Because, well, we can't really move an object from point A to point B as of now. This is science fiction. However, 100 years later, this might be reality. So science fiction, what we call science fiction today, might be, mimetic or realistic literature from 100 years or 200 years. Something as simple as, lunar, exploration. 200 years ago, that is science fiction. Now, if you write about somebody or something on the moon, it's not science fiction. Well, it is science fiction, but then it is also science, because you are talking about a particular thing that has already happened. And that is why, so this difference between science and futuristic science and alternate science and quasi science, it's pretty interesting. And this difference is exploited by different writers in different ways, about how you approach the very idea of science, how you approach the epistemology of science, what is science for you. And that leads us to another very difficult question that has no answer. What is science fiction? Somebody would tell you, well, somebody like Hugo Gernsback would say, well, science fiction is 75% fiction, 25% science. Somebody like Asimov would say, well, you know what? Science fiction is a branch of literature that deals with the impact of science and technology on human behavior. So how human behavior itself changes with science fiction, right? Somebody else might say, well, science fiction is nothing. It's just a marketing category. Somebody else might say, well, science fiction is something that you are pointing at when you're pointing at something. That is science fiction, right? So, I mean, the definitions are endless. If you want to enter into this sort of debate of science fiction, I would recommend you to Shubhanu Banerjee's Indian Science Fiction. I would also recommend you to some articles. Just go to JSTOR and type, and you will find some articles that is that will help you understand this idea. So then again, and then I'll move on to the final part, because I can keep on going about this, because there are no easy answers, but I'm using this as sort of a springboard into further conversation, further discussion with you. So about my favorite science fiction stories, that again is a very difficult question, because I love a lot of them. That's why I'm a nerd. That's why I'm a total science fiction nerd. So if I start talking about them, I'll be talking for the next 4 hours, 5 hours, maybe more. And I don't think we have time for that. So I'll just very quickly point a few names, and then we can move on to other panelists who I'm sure would be better equipped to answer these questions than I am. So I mean, I grew up on Star Trek. So Star Trek, Star Wars, Doctor Who, these are the things that I absolutely adore. They drove me towards science fiction. And I'm actually ashamed to admit it, that I came across Shonku only in class 11th, because I got a translation in my library, and I was like, this is so awesome. We have it in science fiction. I never knew that we have it in science fiction. And then I realized that just because there wasn't Indian science fiction in English at that time in school libraries, that did not mean that India did not have a tradition of science fiction. I was so wrong. And I was so happy to be wrong because I realized that wonderful work had been done in science fiction in Bangla, about which I'm sure Supriyo will talk about, in Marathi, in Tamil, in Assamese. You have these wonderful tradition of science fiction writers across languages. I just hope we have more translations so people like me who only read English or Hindi can read, SF from these languages. I'm also a massive fan of Asimov, Douglas Adams, recently John Scalzi, Alastair Reynolds. From the perspective of India, maybe Shravan Chaudhary, Samit Basu, Vandana Singh. I mean, excellent work is being done. We just think that there is no Indian science fiction because, well, we don't have because we don't have translations in our libraries, or science fiction isn't really a marketable category in India as of now. So we think, some of us think, I used to think that, 15 years ago, that we don't have science fiction. But then you just delve a little bit deeper and you realize it's an ocean in which you can easily drown and have fun while doing it. On that note, over to you.
Thank you so much. That was a lot to take in for everyone. And everyone in the audience, feel free to put in your comments in the chat box and have an open discussion. Even the panel members can interact with you on the chat box if required. And thank you so much for highlighting that Indian science fiction has had a space in India for the longest times, though we might not have always come across it. And I want to just direct the question at Supriyo for this one. How do you see Indian science fiction and especially Bangla science fiction? What are the regional storylines that revolve? How is it different from, say, a Western idea? What are the themes that get covered? If you could talk about that.
Thank you, Shreya. It's an honor to be in such an elite company and speaking about Bengali science fiction or regional science fiction in this great platform you have. Thanks for inviting me. So, coming to your question, when we speak about Indian science fiction or regional science fiction as a whole, we need to understand first the origin of it, and then probably the evolution of it across the phases. So, and it is great, very closely intertwined with the way India has progressed as a nation, pre-independence and post-independence as well. So, as we may be already aware, and many of you are already aware that when you talk about Indian science fiction, the very initial few examples, fortunately, are in Bengali. So, I mean, we have been fortunate to get a glimpse of that so early. One of them, of course, was written by the great scientist Jagadish Chandra Bose. This Ferrari Tufan, the story it's a short story. And then another great example of very early Indian science fiction was the Sultana's Dream. It was both written in Bengali and English simultaneously with the same author, So that was the beginning of the journey, and then we had a flurry of science fiction authors written coming up in the era of 30s and 40s, who primarily were inspired by the great maestros of the world science fiction back then, predominantly Verne, Poe, H.G. Wells, of course. But if I keep those things aside, like the inspired science fiction, I would probably, I think probably all of you would be agreeing with me that we cannot call Western inspired science fiction as Indian science fiction. So if we turn our focus on what we can actually call Indian science fiction, I believe the first two examples I gave, Jagadish Chandra Bose's Palatak Tufan and Sakawat Hussein's Sultana's Dream. Those were actually Indian in theme and construction. And I'll greatly recommend the audience here to go through those if they have not already read those. And then beyond that, whatever examples we found, one thing was clear, like, so okay, that was one era. Then let's come to the post-independence era. So in the post-independence also, as in the 50s and 60s, thematically, whatever we see, science fiction is coming up, if you compare it with to the Western science fiction of that era, we see a marked difference where we don't see any grand scale adventure kind of science fiction which were getting written in the West, like the space operas or things like that, which revolves around space explorations and then reaching out outer planets and colonizing them, probably because of the history of colonization which we had, which was still fresh in Indian side. And also one possibility can be like, the space exploration or space science itself was a concept too foreign for a country which has just gained its independence and had its own problem to deal with, which was far, moved apart from the space science at that point in time. There are some exceptions, of course, but but again, since the English was the only available medium of expression of the international science fiction for the authors, so the influence by the American way of thinking about science fiction was always there. But in general, that was the way it was in the post-World War II era. Now, next came the era of 50s and 60s, where India was still trying to build itself as a nation, and we had certain problems in hand to deal with, like food security, building a proper education infrastructure, healthcare. So that all got reflected to science as well, because science was imagined as a resort to solve those social and for problems in our day-to-day life. And the examples we have seen there, primarily the things which, types of stories which were being written at that point by Adrish Burton and some of the other notable science fiction authors in Bengali. They imagined science as the solution for those problems. Like some stories we find that which revolves around invention that solves the food scarcity problem by multiplying the production, or a serum that suddenly generates super intelligent human beings who are kind of who are able to solve critical problems with just a jiffy, or healthcare miracle cure for all physical ailments. Dr. Khan spoke about Shanku, so you must be aware, like there's one very celebrated imaginary invention of Professor Shanku, which is the miraculous medicine, which cures all the ailments. That itself is a depiction or reflection of the problem with the healthcare infrastructure we had at that point in our society, in my opinion.
So I can say that a lot of the Indian science fiction has focused a lot on what is happening in society at that point in time. I think one person's question has also come up in the chat, that is Indian science fiction limited by Indian technological advancement and potential for advancement or breaking unimaginable barriers? Sir, the relatability of any work for an audience, is it important for gaining traction? So I think what they're trying to gauge is, what if something seems unimaginable for India? Does that limit our ability to imagine a science fiction story around that?
In a way, yes. I would also like to hear Dr. Khan and Dr. Khilnani opinion also about that. But in a way, my observation says yes, we still have that. Whatever is happening in the society around us in terms of scientific development, as well as the problems we are facing in the society, or the challenges we see, or even the things which gives us pleasure, that gets reflected. It's a culmination of everything, and any genre of literature is a culmination of the things that are happening around us, and science fiction also cannot be an exception in that matter.
Thank you so much, Mr. Das. I will go to Dr. Shweta from here. I just want to know that you've taken a broad lens on science fiction in India, and we've had like a lot of narratives, storylines, or rather points coming in about what is science fiction, what are the science fictions that have encouraged us to look into it, what is Indian science fiction, what do you see broadly as Indian science fiction, and and also I just wanted to know what were your motivations on doing research in Indian science fiction, and if you want to share some interesting findings, that would be great.
Thanks. First of all, thank you for having me here. And please, I'm just Shweta. um, why I was actually introduced to science fiction by my students. So it was one of those, I mean, of course, we've read the basic, the more canonical stories here and there, but with my students who came to me often and would tell me that we read this work here and there. And then we started organizing these series of movie screenings of science fiction movies for our students. And that's what led me into the field, and that's how sort of I came to it. So as opposed to Sami, I had a very different sort of interaction with the genre as such. What I would call Indian science fiction, I think, is again, if you just break it down into the three terms, that are a part of that sort of category, we can get somewhere, I would say. Uh, Sami had this wonderful way of using like an object to tell you about what is science fiction. I mean, even though it's a very, like he says, it's a very nebulous category to define. But, if you look at the term itself, science fiction, I've always sort of found it that the kind of dance between the two terms is a very good way to sort of understand the genre, because traditionally, I'm saying traditionally, you associate science with empiricism, rationality, modernity, verifiable things that are real, yeah. And fiction is, of course, quite the contrary, which is, you think of fiction as made up stories or that are not necessarily real. They're not bound to reality in a certain way. And somehow it's this very, and I use the word dance sort of very carefully because I think it kind of, catches that essence. It's the interaction between the two that defines in some way, science fiction, that it is an exaggeration of reality, but it's not as if it's completely divorced from reality either. It is non-mimetic, as Sami said. So it's still a comment on reality in some way, right? So that's always been like my first sort of way of pitching the term itself, the genre itself. And then adding Indian to it sort of adds a completely, a sort of very different dimension to it altogether, I would say. Because again, there are like thousand different definitions of what does it mean to be Indian. Yeah, and who am I to say that this is one definition of being Indian? And I think that's a great thing about Indian SF as a category, is that it's able to introduce different ways of understanding Indianness in a certain way, what it means to be a part of this country, what it means to have a colonial past, so both in terms of the past, in terms of the present, and a projected future. How do these stories make you think of certain ways or certain questions related to identity, national identity, in a different way? So I think that would be a good way to sort of enter the category, try to think of each different term and then how they are related to each other and how they kind of add and force us to revise our definitions of each other all the time.
That's right. And these are quite a lot of interesting ideas that you've put forth about what exactly is Indianness and what are we trying to kind of. I see science fiction as this creative space which kind of cannot be very well defined as far as I've gotten from the conversation. Yet science is something that actually aspires to be as objective as possible. So it's a pretty interesting conundrum, I might say that. And with that, I want to know if I could just probe a little bit further about your book, Shweta, and maybe some of the interesting findings that you found from researching about science fiction in India. Where do you see Indian science fiction going in the next couple of years?
Well, I'll start by talking about some of the things that we found very interesting, me and my co-editor, Ritik Bhattacharya, because when we started sort of working on this field. And the first thing, like, somebody's already mentioned something in the comments, is the very different understanding of science itself when it comes to, the Indian sort of cultural framework. And this is, of course, something that both Sami and Supriyo, he mentioned Supriyo Banerjee, have written about. Sami has the rare feat of being both a writer of science fiction and then also a critic. So he, of course, has a much wider perspective on this. But the very idea of science is perhaps different when it comes to an Indian setup, because it's not limited to, again, the idea of rational empiricism that one would associate with a Western sort of notion of science. So it's this, I think Shweta has gone on to say that it's this weird blend of this very technological understanding of science, also myth and folklore and religion, and anything that you use as a way to negotiate the reality around you, to understand, oh, why is this pen, like Sami said, why is this pen here? Why does the sun rise in a particular direction, set in a particular direction? Now, over the years, we've had different explanations of these things. And while a very Western notion would be dismissive of these ideas, in our country for a long time, we've used those ideas to make sense of the world around us. And, in a way, that's what science is. So a very different understanding of science that we saw, and that is reflected in then the kind of Indian science fiction stories that you see, because you'll see that they'll a lot of people will say, why has there never been Indian science fiction as such, even though, as Supriyo would say, there's so much in regional languages. It was never really translated into English, and that was perhaps one major problem of accessibility. But that's the other possible way of looking at it is because our notion of science itself is very different. So what we have now is this kind of very genre bending sort of a collection of something that might not look like very typical hard SF, as it were, but it would have elements of mythology and religion and gods and goddesses blended with technology, with science, with experiments going on here and there, with AI, So it gives rise to this very rich, seemingly sometimes bizarre, surreal sort of collection of fiction. That was the second thing that we sort of came across, and the ease with which these different genres came across, sort of blended together in the field of Indian science fiction, is something that really stood out for us. And of course, the specificity, the cultural specificity that you will see, how even an imagined future in Indian SF would always hark back to the past in some ways. So how it would reflect both the anxieties, the joys, everything of a very, again, and I'm going to say Indianness and Indian identity, whatever that is, as it evolves over time.
Awesome. Okay, so I want to just forward the question to Sami for this one. So how do we see, if you could maybe just kind of elaborate a little bit more on what Shweta said about the Indianness of science, and what do you see that to be? And how will we are moving away from the anglicized version of science fiction. And so how do you see that coming in as upcoming writers are, as the Indian science fiction space is growing in India, how do you see that growing in the next couple of years?
Okay. See, I think that Bal Pondke once said that the Indianness of Indian science fiction is a result of its soul. So it brings in the idea of Atma. The soul has something to do with how Indian SF works. And to give you just one example of what Shweta was also talking about, I think in Ashok Banker's Gods of War, which is a wonderful novel, 2008 or 9, I think the novel begins with something like, so Ganesh piloting the god Ganesh, piloting the starship, came and stopped near Earth Lagrange point L5. I was like, what? So he actually has an actual god piloting a starship that comes to Earth from the multiversal continuum and stops. I'm like, what is happening here? What kind of science fiction is this? And that is the beauty of it, because this entire idea of how mythology, ideology, and technology flow and contour Indian SF is pretty fascinating to read and understand. And I guess this is also the right time to talk about the entire historicity of it all, about and how it engages with current debates. So when I was working on science fiction, I met essentially two kinds of people. The first kind told me, well, oh, science fiction, Indian science fiction, this is lovely. We have had Indian science fiction always. Emphasis on always. And I was like, what do you mean? And they were like, well, if you read the Mahabharata or Ramayana, well, then the Brahmastras are nuclear weapons. And it talks about interstellar travel and other worlds. And I was like, that is pretty fascinating. The other kind said, well, we never had science fiction at all. Science fiction is something which is a recent 21st century import into India, or maybe 1950s, 60s onwards. We don't have science fiction at all. And I was like, okay. But then when you start, researching, when you start reading, you realize that truth is actually different from both of these perspectives. The first perspective is a great political perspective. It gives you votes, but it doesn't give you an academic rigor. The second perspective doesn't really take all the data into consideration. So something as simple as, and hang on, I'm going to share this. I had written this. I'm going to copy paste this. And then I found out that, okay, my particular understanding would be something like this. And this is something which Supriyo had also talked about. But if you just scan just three languages, Bangla, Hindi, English, you will realize that SF in India is coming to age at the same time, at almost the same time it is coming to age in the West. So it's not something that we recently imported from the West. Consequently, it's also not something that we have had for the past 5,000 years. Science fiction emanates from science, from post-enlightenment, industrial revolution, that kind of science. When it comes to India, that is when we have, the kind of this very hybridized, multi-dimensional entity called Indian science fiction. And the history becomes very important because the way we perceive science, the way we appropriate science, and the way we enforce science on narratives, the way we see, okay, well, this is something, this was written 5,000 years ago, this is science. Or this is something that will be written 5,000 years later, this will be science. So the notion of science changes. And this is what I think Shweta was also talking about. What is science today will not be, would not have been science 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago. It would have been fantasy or mythology or speculative fiction. But science changes, of course. Science is not static. Science keeps on changing. And if science keeps on changing, if fiction is in a state of constant flux, of constant flux, then SF automatically changes. And where we are reading SF from, why we are reading SF, why we are writing SF, what is the, the vantage point from which we engage with science and fiction, that determines of what science fiction, just becomes. And to link it with what Supriyo was also talking about, yes, the national context is extremely important. For example, when Manjula Padmanabhan writes Escape, she paints a society in which women have been banned by the state. When I say banned, women have literally been banned and they have been exterminated because they were considered, of course, Manjula Padmanabhan is talking about India's declining sex ratio. She's talking about, the excesses of patriarchy. She's talking about how certain parts of India have become unsafe for women. That's true. I mean, Delhi, you guys know what Delhi is called. I mean, so yes, there is a very strong local component in SF narratives, and that responds directly to the material realities of the production and consumption of that text. That is absolutely true. But at the same time, science is not something that belongs to one nation or one country or one people or one group. Science is universal. Science belongs to all of us. And therefore, there's this, again, just as you have a tussle between science and fiction, you have a tussle between the local, the global, and the global in science fiction. And there is no particular one way this tussle happens, because almost every single writer has his own, his or her own idea of how they engage with A, external reality, B, science, C, what they are trying to say and why they are trying to say it, right? And we're all assuming that this happens because almost every single writer has a particular ideological stand. Some of them might say, well, I'm just writing for the fun of it. I'm just writing because I'm interested in writing this. I'm not writing to make a larger political point, right? You can also, so I'm writing for the aesthetics of it all, right? I'm not writing for political purposes. So it's a pretty, and that is why it is so much fun working on this and reading this, because with every single book, you get a different perspective, right? So just to talk about dystopias, Samit Basu talks about dystopias in Delhi. Lavanya Lakshminarayan talks about dystopias in Bangalore. Vandana Singh talks about dystopias in Calcutta and utopias at other places, right? So every writer does something. My favorite, Shovan Chaudhary, the way he writes about Delhi, fascinating. Then you have Rajat Chaudhary, who talks about, again, Calcutta, genetic engineering, dystopia. So you have different ideas coming, and it's just fun. I mean, I associate science fiction with fun because I do it because I'm a fan. I read it to have fun. So, but then while having fun, you realize that science fiction uh, comments so much on the world in which it is produced and consumed that it's, you can just see it. You can see it. That science fiction is not normative. I mean, I think this is, yeah, I think this might be Le Guin. I'm forgetting. Science fiction is not normative. It's descriptive. It's describing how things are as of now, not how things should be. Well, of course, it can talk about how things should be, but at the same time, especially Indian science fiction is very conscious of what is happening today. And if you read Manjula Padmanabhan, Vandana Singh, Priyasa Rukai Chhabdiya, Anil Menon, Samit Basu, Lavanya Lakshminarayan, you will realize that these guys are talking about what is happening in our newspapers. It's directly there. You don't even have to delve deeper into it. It's right there in front of you. And at the same time, they're using science fiction as a mode of storytelling. Science fiction is not a genre; it's a mode. Because it somehow includes all the other genres within its ambit. Something like Koi Mil Gaya, right? Koi Mil Gaya is science fiction. Alien, right? Alien coming, but it's also romance. It's also thrill. It's also suspense. It's also horror, right? So this is what science fiction does. That don't see science fiction as a genre. See it as a mode that somehow brings everything together, garbs them under the cloak of science and technology and mythology and ideology and political expediency, and tells you a story that is fun. With that, back to you.
Thank you so much. I think we're seeing a lot of common themes coming in, wherein the idea or the concept of science fiction is kind of becoming clearer to me as well. And also I mean, it is a new idea for me to think that science fiction is a commentary on what is happening today. Thank you so much for sharing that insight. As Indian science fiction perspectives are brought in and grows along with Western science fiction space, I want to put this question to Supriyo, and this is also a question that someone has asked in the chat. Sarvesh has asked this. What are the incentives to write Indian science fiction in Indian languages? How much of a readership do we have? Could you give us some perspective about how Kalpabiswa has been, engaging their audience, and maybe some of the challenges that you face and some of the merits of doing?
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you talk about the readership, yeah, I mean, it takes time. So we did start Kalpabiswa web magazine way back in 2016 and running it's completed 8th year right now. So initially there was, I would not say that we had a bad response. Like just initial curiosity was there, which did, I mean, garner certain readership. Then in between we saw certain things waning, and then we also did mature a bit in terms of our content and in terms of how we manage the website and the magazine. And now we do have a steady readership. I mean, it is not, I would not say that, I mean, of course, I mean, writing in vernacular language versus writing in English, which is a globally accepted language. Of course, you cannot compare the readership of an English language publication with something which is in a vernacular language or a native language. So, yeah, I mean, readership, I would not say it is not there. It is not, I mean, astonishing, or it is not even, I would not say even that it is not encouraging. it's moderate, I would say. Now coming to the incentives, like in that terms, I would like to explain like what was our main motive of building a platform like Kalpabiswa in Bengali language. So in Bengali, what had happened is like till 1970s, we consider like 60s and 70s kind of golden era of Bengali science fiction, where we saw a lot of movements in terms of science fiction, with primarily led by the people like Ajit Vartan, Ranen Ghosh, Anish Dev, and we had very popular, a few very popular science fiction themed printed magazines like Vishwaya, Ascharya. All this had decent readership, but after 80s, we saw a gradual decline in both quality and quantity of the Bengali science fiction. And by the time we reached around 2010, we observed that there are very few new works are being produced in Bengali science fiction, and we kind of thought that this thing needs a revival. So some of us, like a few enthusiasts like me, gathered and formed a group and started this idea. Like so initially it was a little difficult for us to directly go into the print medium, because it's a print medium or a printed magazine as such has a lot of limitations in terms of the number of stories you can publish or the word limit. It involves cost. So we chose the online platform where we can bypass these limitations. And the main idea was that to start it and try to build an ecosystem, like where we can give opportunity to the new writers who wants to write science fiction, or even the established writers who have excelled in some other genre and then now want to try their hand in science fiction. Give them a platform and see how it works. Like so what happened is there were few people who wanted to write science fiction, but the kind of stories they were writing was not finding any place in the established printed magazines because of various reasons. And they needed a platform to take their writing to the reader and test it, like what is the reaction. And readers also wanted a taste, like what is science fiction? Like we have read the science fictions written in 60s and 70s, but what it means. And if I want to, if somebody writes a science fiction in the modern context, which standing at 2010 or 2015, how it is going to be. So that was the sole purpose. Like at one side of the platform was the readers and the other side of the writers, and it should be a symbiotic relationship between both of them, where the writers can test their creation, and then readers also can get a taste of different types of experimental things a writer can produce in the genre of science fiction.
Hey, thank you so much for that one. We also have another question by Priyanka asking, what is the difference between science fiction and speculative fiction? If you could give us some insights on that.
Okay.
Supriyo, yeah.
So speculative fiction as a genre, it can be, I mean, in a sense, these are quite similar. Like, in technically speaking, science fiction is considered a subset of speculative fiction, where we try to extrapolate or predict a problem, or make some prophetic prediction about what is going to happen in future, or how a certain development which is happening in at present can impact our future, or even our present. Like something which has happened in past might have certain kind of impact in our present, which we are not, which has not happened yet, but there is a possibility that can happen. For example, the COVID. So we all know how COVID has impacted our society, our world as a whole. But there could have been a different kind of impact as well. Yeah, I mean, it could have impacted our present in a different way. So that also is considered as a speculative fiction. And now, when the impact or the prediction we are making is backed by science or some scientific development that has happened in past or happened in present as well, like AI generative models, that becomes science fiction. But if something is, like say, alternative history, some historical, what would have happened if the Nazis had won World War II. So a very famous creation by Philip K. Dick, The Man in the High Castle, delves around that. That is also speculative fiction. That is not exactly a science fiction. I mean, there is no scientific background to it. It's just that what would have happened? What if? So that is speculative fiction, I would say.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for those points as well. Shweta, I will direct some questions to you now. I was more keen on asking questions about Indian and Western science fiction, but I think we've looked at it quite a lot in the lens of what we are writing, what we are thinking, what we are commenting on. And I think this is a question, a little challenging question perhaps that I'm throwing towards you. But we have this question in the chat box. It's why do you think science fiction, and please comment on it if this is a wrong statement, why do you think science fiction is still not a marketable genre in India?
I think again, because I think the answer is somewhere in the question itself, because you're still kind of ascribing to well-defined, rigid notions of what science fiction should look like, which come from the West. That a book of science fiction should have aliens, a book of science fiction should have time travel, a book of science fiction should essentially deal with ideas of technological development. Like someone also said that, we as a country don't have certain levels of technological development. So how can we have fiction that is related to that? The problem is that our science fiction just looks a little different from the notions of science fiction that are traditionally inscribed in our heads, perhaps, because like Sami said, our science fiction will have gods piloting, UFOs or whatever you want to call them. They'll have, divine elements and religious elements and mythic elements. But again, the kind of thrust is still the same in some ways, to interrogate your present, your reality, but by presenting it as an alternative reality or an imaginable future or an exaggerated version of your reality or whatever else. So it's not, it's not a marketable genre in India, maybe because of that. Also, again, maybe because, SF is by definition non-mimetic, is what we're saying. And non-mimetic is something that does not conform to reality. But again, that non-mimetic something that does not conform to Western notion of reality. Our reality to begin with is very, very different. Perhaps, our reality is someone else's of science fiction or someone else's bizarre, surreal fantasy. Yeah. And so we need to when we think of Indian sci-fi, I think we have to think of it in context of our reality, our immediate world that we live in, our past, our present, and our future will be determined by these, or the future that we imagine will always be determined by these factors.
Right. Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Sami.
Just to build on this, since we are talking about speculative fiction and science fiction, I mean, absolutely, speculative fiction is this umbrella term that comprises science fiction, fantasy, mythology, etc., etc., and science fiction is one of those components. And then perhaps if you were to assume that the speculative fiction of a language remains constant, as in the overall volume, the overall focus remains constant, and speculative fiction is comprised of science fiction, mythology, and fantasy. That means that if we have less of science fiction, that is contingent on the fact that we have more of fantasy and mythology. So, I mean, it kind of cancels each other out, because we all have speculative imaginations, of course. We all have speculative imaginings, and we may have had less of science fiction, but that was offset by the fact that we had more of mythology. But things are changing in the 21st century, and science fiction, the future of science fiction looks bright. Just trying to explicate this in whatever means possible. Yeah, over to you.
All right. We also have a question on education, and one of the attendees is wondering if our conventional education system is also limiting our imagination in science fiction. Any comments on that? Anyone can take that up.
I mean, okay, fine.
Please
I can
feel
take it.
free. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. We are supposed to memorize stuff. We have to learn by rote. We are extremely good at keeping systems running. Indian engineers dominate the world. They're extremely good at keeping systems running. We're also good with R&D. But when it comes to India, somehow the focus is still on keeping the system running rather than creating a new system, from the scratch. Like for example, the US has been doing for quite some time that, the entire idea of brain drain, that you take the best and you somehow, NASA, for example, is staffed by a lot of Indians. Yes, that is true. That education system somehow, if it tells you not to think out of the box and just focus on what you have and just memorize it and just go and vomit that during your examination to get, distinction or 90 plus, then of course, I mean, if we are teaching kids this from class 1 or class 2 itself, then it is going to percolate down because you will not think in that direction. But at the same time, human beings are extremely resilient creatures. They will break through these shackles, and they do that. And you can see that in the kind of work that is being produced and that has been produced, that people will always exceed the limitations that are imposed on them by their external reality.
Thank you so much for those points. And it's interesting. I actually did not think that education might have an impact on the way we would think creatively, but you did put in a very valid point at that. I think there are some questions about your creative processes as writers, and people wanted to know in the comments, what are some of the strategies that you use to think about your stories, and if there are any specific resources that you use to develop your stories. So any comments on that? Anyone can take that up. Feel free.
I think Sami would be the right person to answer that, since he's also a
He's the
writer
only
of
writer.
science fiction. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, yeah, sure. I mean, there are no specific resources as such. I think that if you read the newspapers, you will get enough material to write a science fiction story. But at the same time, I would like to quote what Anil Menon once told me. He said, I hope you are busy working on good stories and not good science fiction stories. So since this is linked to a writing competition, I would also say that, well, labels exist, but you exist to break them. So break them as much as possible. Feel free to play with this entire form, and just be on the lookout to tell good stories. And whether they are science fiction or fantasy or mythology or horror or romance or whatever works for you. What works for me is science fiction, and but that may not always work for you. And what works for me is a particular kind of science fiction. You may just work on a different kind of science fiction, a different aspect of science fiction. So because science fiction is not a monolith, it's not something that is a stable entity that you can go and find and say, okay, define this as science fiction. Science fiction is how you perceive your reality. Science fiction is how you exist. Science fiction is how you behave. Science fiction is how you want to be. So pick your own setting. It's a very generic answer, but it's the only generic answer that matters. Because if I tell you, okay, science fiction is this, I'm going to tell you what science fiction is, and now you have to write science fiction based on what I think is science fiction. That's stupid. I mean, I'm not going to tell you that. So pick your own poison, as they say, and just go with it. In terms of me, when I was, and since again linking this with the entire idea of marketing, because we were discussing about marketing category and marketing, science fiction. When I was writing my first novel, almost 12 years ago, everybody told me, dude, what are you doing? Why are you writing a future war narrative? Future war narrative, science fiction, this kind of thing doesn't sell. Write a romance thing. That's what sells. And I was like, I'm not writing to sell. I'm writing because this makes me happy. If you want to publish it, don't. I was just happy writing it. Something similar happened with my second novel, that everybody's like, why are you writing alien interventions in Delhi? Why are you doing this? This doesn't sell. Write romance, write mythology. That is what sells as of now. But then this is a question that you have to ask yourself as writers. Are you writing to sell? Are you writing for the market? In that case, you have to write a different kind of narrative. Or are you writing for yourself or for something else? Because you have to choose what you are doing and why you are doing. Nobody else can tell you to do otherwise. It has to be your choice, and it has to come from within.
Thank you so much, Sami. I think we're coming to the end of our session. Those are really amazing insights. I have seen the chat box going pretty crazy with a lot of thoughts, a lot of ideas, lots of recommendations and questions that I have tried to address throughout the session. I wanted to ask Shweta if you have any final comments to add in before we leave this meeting, this discussion.
Not really. I mean, I think it's been a very rich discussion, and we've come. Some of I should say that some of the comments and questions in the chat box are so insightful, and sometimes I mean, I wish my students were asking questions like this. It would just make teaching so much more enjoyable. So I'm so happy. I mean, someone said that. Asked about the degree of imagination that they're allowed to exercise. If they write something completely unrealistic, would it still be science fiction? Now, again, canonically, maybe no. You're looking for a certain degree of cognitive recognizability as well in science fiction. But again, like Sami says, we're here to break boundaries. We're here to create new genres, as it were. And so I think this is the time to sort of exercise that and experiment, as it were. So yeah, I think that's my final word.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sami. Thank you, Shweta. Thank you, Supriyo, for giving in your comments, for sharing your time. Is there anything you would like to add, Supriyo?
Only thing is, I would like to recommend one reading to the audience here, which is Locating Science Fiction by Andrew Milner. So if you are really willing to explore and understand what science fiction is about, that is one of the best books I have come across. So I would strongly recommend that people who are really interested to go through that.
Thank you so much. I think I will have a separate discussion with the panel members here, including all the other jury members who we have for the Spin Your science fiction writing competition, to probably look up some good resources. We already have a couple of resources in the guidelines document, but I think a lot of other references have come in the chat, and I will compile the same and share it with all the attendees over here. The attendees are mostly individuals who are interested in participating in our competition, exploring science fiction, as well as some of them who already submitted their work. And so the enthusiasm is quite high. Thank you so much for guiding them through the concept, to give them insights, and thank you so much for your time as well. With that, I would like to end this session, and also still encourage everyone who's been part of this webinar to look up at the India Science Festival, the science fiction writing competition, Spin Your Science, and to share your creative entries in that. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.